Christians, continuing my little mini series that I call Make Egypt Great Again. This is part 9. And we're talking about how this new king, this new Pharaoh that replaced the Pharaoh that Joseph was under, and what his agenda is to essentially make Egypt great again. And in his mind, the greatness of Egypt would be radically improved and accelerated if they could slow the growth of the Israelites, if they can crush the will of the Israelites, if they could impoverish the Israelites, if they can increase the burdens upon them of the work to do and to tax them so high that they could never pay it back, they would eventually break their wills and hold them in bondage, in service, and in subjugation to the state of Egypt, that is. As I also stated, they were subjected to a situation where, unlike the kind of slavery that we know in modern times, theirs was different. As I stated previously, they owned their own homes and they had places where they lived. And so their slavery was different because basically all of them were slaves of the state rather than slaves and servants of individuals. So it's different in that regard as well. So they had homes that they can go to. They had property that belonged to them. They had the wherewithal to work, although the Pharaoh, this new king, was making an imposition on them to do grievous tasks that they would never be able to carry out efficiently, and it would give them it would give the Egyptians the reason and the justification to continue to apply pressure, undue pressure and affliction, to make living impossible. So we see that he started his campaign to deal shrewdly and craftily with the Israelites, as he said he wanted to do in verse 10 of Exodus chapter 1, Exodus 1 verse 10. So then they set these taskmasters over them, which are really tax gatherers and creators of onerous burdens to put on the Israelites. So their campaign of affliction began. And one of their first tasks was to build these supply cities or store cities whereby they would store all of the product that they had imposed on the Israelites to build, create, tend to, and whatnot. So they would create all these little cities to store things, and there was like little mini Fort Knoxes everywhere. That's probably one of the best ways to look at it. State-owned storage of goods and supplies. So now we get to verse 12. And it says that the more that the Egyptians afflicted the Israelites, the more the Israelites multiplied and grew. So the pressure that this new king was imposing upon the Israelites was having the opposite effect for that which he expected. He expected that this rigorous imposition of burdens and will crushing duties, he thought that it would stifle their growth and manage or even decrease. What he expected was to decrease or to manage their population boom. But it says here that no matter, the more they did, the more Israel grew. The more pressure that this Egyptian king put on Israel, the more they grew. And this was contrary to the plan that this Pharaoh had in doing what he was doing. He expected the exact opposite effect. Let this be a lesson to oppressors. When oppressors oppress, they provide the impetus for growth on the oppressed. And this is what is happening here. So it says here that the more the Egyptians afflicted the Israelites, they grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. Now they're in total fear of them. Now, it says here in verse 13, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel suffer or serve with rigor. And what does this mean? It means now that they're going to impose such a degree of rigor on the Israelites that they would do it in such a way where they would absolutely show no mercy. And this is how you have to look at wicked people, oppressors. Regardless of their unfounded fears, the Egyptians, they were not interested in the slightest sentiment of clemency toward Israel. No mercy, no clemency, just brutal force in terms of imposing rigorous duties on them that are impossible to maintain. But in spite of all of that, they continued to grow, which was contrary to the plan of this king. So they were goaded by the frustration of whatever their hope was to continue to step up their relentless course of oppression against the Israelites. So they thought, well, our goal was to crush them and to stop them from growing. Our goal was to impose these rigors on them so that we would manage their population and slow it down, if not stop it altogether. And they found out that the more they did, the more Israel would grow. So what did they do? They decided to double down. They decided, we are going to make Egypt great again, so we're going to double down. If the rigors that we already have imposed weren't enough and they are continuing to multiply, then let's be more rigorous. Not concluding in their minds that, well, if we double down, it might mean that the rapid rate in which they will increase might double. That's not how they reason. They said, well, if they're still growing, even more so, in spite of what we're doing, well, let's just turn it up a little bit and see what happens. And so this is how wicked men are. Wicked men are so slow to be taught that when their insane schemes are defeated, they never know that it is God that is fighting against them. They never know. And you can't fight against God. There used to be this old musical when I was growing up. And it was called Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God. And the Egyptians were fighting with God. And so any thought about giving in on the part of Egypt, any thought about them giving in or bringing any ease served as fuel to make them even more reckless in their efforts to persecute these people in the way of rebellion, as we will eventually see in what happens later. Because remember, this was the beginning for Israel, the beginning of that 400 years that they would be in bondage to Egypt. This is the beginning point. 430 years, they're going to go through this, and it takes 430 years before God has his day of reckoning with Egypt. And keep in mind, Egypt has always been emblematic of the sinful world, the world governed by Antichrist and anti-Christian principles. Egypt was the superpower of the day. And it took 430 years before God would have his day of reckoning with Pharaoh at the time. But this is the beginning. This is the seedbed of jumpstarting this mission to make Egypt great again. And the way that they want to do this is to humiliate and subjugate a people that was not their enemy in the first place. And so Egypt went headlong into their persecution, and they will find out it will come to nothing.